And that was backed up to some extent by the Uruguay round agreements of the GATT. But what these countries didn't do was negotiate lots of separate bilateral free trade agreements, which are by definition discriminatory. They discriminate against outsiders. Now that changed from about the year 2000, because what we have seen since then in Malaysia and elsewhere in the region is a slowdown of doing it by yourself liberalization, unilateral liberalization that is. We have seen a disengagement from the WTO, and we have seen a proliferation of so-called free trade agreements or FTAs. And Malaysia is about there or thereabouts, so it's quite high up in the list of those who have been actively negotiating FTAs in Asia. I think there are about 27 in all. 11 of them are signed and in effect. They include a lot of these ASEAN plus one FTAs with China, India, Japan, and others. And then you have bilaterals, which are this list here. And of course, there are negotiations that are on the go, and three in particular, to which I will return a little later. There is something called RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. You can trust trade negotiators to come up with terrible English and lots of rather unwieldy acronyms that not only do violence but murder the English language. RCEP is one such. Then you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which of course is a subject of controversy here, led by the United States. And then, of course, there's a Malaysia-European Union FTA negotiation ongoing. I will come back to these a little later. Let me say a word about what these FTAs have meant so far for Malaysia, and it's a typical Asian pattern. With no exceptions, the FTAs that Malaysia is involved in are what I would call trade light. I have a chart here from something I did for the Asian Development Bag a few years ago about the strength of many of these FTAs and comparing countries. And the Malaysian FTAs, the stronger ones, they take down about 90% or thereabouts of tariffs. The sensitive products are left to be liberalized later. But they're very weak when it comes to everything else. When it comes to disciplines on non-tariff barriers to imports, on regulating and deliberalizing services, on liberalizing investment further, particularly in services. They have nothing to say on public procurement and on many other issues. So in reality, given that tariffs have already come down quite a bit in the region and beyond, they do hardly anything to liberalize trade further. And they bring complications in their wake, because these agreements are a bureaucrat's paradise. They're full of all kinds of discriminations, particularly when it comes to something technical like rules of origin, which I won't bore you with today, that discriminate against trade with outsiders and can put a spanner in the works of global supply chains, because global supply chains are supposed to move around seamlessly around the globe by definition. So on balance, these FTAs may not have done that much harm so far, but they have hardly done any good either. They have been largely symbolic or paper tigers. That's the way I would broadly interpret it. And then what I have left for last in this part of my presentation is the ASEAN Economic Community, which is, of course, one of Malaysia's core FTAs. Now, as I said before, liberalization in ASEAN has happened overwhelmingly at the national level and unilaterally. But since the early 90s, there have been attempts to integrate regionally through regional initiatives. So it started with AFTA, the Free Trade Agreement, and that has morphed into something more ambitious, at least on paper, the ASEAN Economic Community, with a single market for trade in goods and services, for the flow of capital, and also for the movement of skilled workers, which is supposed, hey presto, to come into existence in December this year. Now, where they have had success is in taking down most of the tariffs. So about 70% of tariffs in the region have come down to zero. And that, of course, has put pressure on Malaysia, particularly in cars. But beyond that, progress has been very slow, predictably. So even though the ASEAN Secretariat tells us that there's been an 80% plus success rate, don't believe it, because in practice that's simply not the case. That is typical ASEAN papering over the cracks. So when it comes to really taking down barriers, with few exceptions, like open skies for civil aviation and the ASEAN single window for trade facilitation, a single market is very far from coming into being. It still remains highly fragmented with lots of barriers on services, on investment, nothing on government procurement, on all sorts of trade rules. Standards remain very different country to country. So the reality, the bold reality, is that there is no real ASEAN single market that's going to come into being this year. And given that ASEAN proceeds in a slow, incremental, lowest common denominator way, there isn't going to be a single market, in all likelihood, in 2020 or 2025, or possibly in most of our lifetimes. We will see. Right. But I think one has just to accept this reality and then try and improve it without expecting a true single market in the European sense, or even in the North American sense, to emerge anytime soon. Okay, to try and answer in a nutshell this question after the review I've done of what accounts for Malaysia's economic successes and failures, particularly on the trade front and the foreign investment front. Well, Malaysia, of course, is a lucky country, as Sri Lanka used to be, with its plantation crops and, of course, more recently with its oil and gas revenues. But I think one should add that the real engine of Malaysian wealth has come from making its own luck, and that's opening its economy to these global value chains in manufacturing so far, which has delivered these huge gains in productivity and growth and prosperity. And in my view, I think the record of success that Malaysia has seen to date has got very much to do with what the World Bank once called getting the basics right. In other words, having prudent macroeconomic policies, getting your budget close to balance, having an anti-inflationary monetary policy, having a flexible and open labor market. 1 in 4 workers in this economy at least is a foreigner. That's one example of that. Having good infrastructure, and then, crucially, being open to the world. Now, the benefits of openness, I think, are abundantly clear here in the economic or material sense, but let me say a little bit more about that. The importance of the openness of the economy. It has done many things. It has enabled Malaysia to get into a division of labor as other countries, such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and crucially Singapore, have become richer. Malaysia has occupied the next rung. That was its ladder to success. Let me dwell on that point with Singapore. At the risk, perhaps, of upsetting a few in the audience. Part of Malaysia's boon has been proximity to Singapore. So Malaysia has been able to copy or emulate Singapore in many respects to Malaysia's benefit. And openness is very much part of that. And openness, I think, is not just about bread and butter. An open world economy is also one of the biggest disciplinary mechanisms of keeping politics as honest as possible. So it is very much about domestic politics. Because when you're open to the world, when you have competition, when the doors are open to outsiders, there is less room for cronyism, corruption, rent-seeking, and all the opacity, as opposed to transparency, that go with it. And that, I think, is a point that's worth emphasizing again and again. Now, what about industrial policy? And by industrial policy, I mean particularly the variety of industrial policy where government thinks it's intelligent and picks winners and targets selected sectors and selected firms and protects them against both domestic and foreign competition. Well, Tun Mahathir, Martin Kaur, his good friend from the Third World Network, K.S. Jomo and others would accord great importance to this kind of industrial policy. But in my book, this has failed conspicuously in Malaysia in the last few decades. There are prime examples. Dr. Mahathir had his HICOM project in the 1970s and the 1980s, trying to emulate the South Koreans. It led to massive overinvestment in the public sector, an orgy of corruption, and a crisis which Dr. Mahathir, ever the pragmatist, used to liberalize the economy. That was Malaysia's boon. And then think of the disaster that was and remains Proton. There is even now talk, I hear, of an ASEAN car. Well, there's been talk of that before. And then think of lots of GLCs in the economy today. Maybe not as glaring examples as the ones I've given, but still big drags on the economy. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, there are those who argue that this all happened because Malaysia, like other Southeast Asian countries, with the exception of Singapore, had or has governments that are weak or soft in comparison to hard, intelligent, strong governments that exist or used to exist in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And my answer to that is largely bunkum. The problem, true, governments in this part of the world may have been softer and more corrupt than their equivalents in Northeast Asia. But the answer to that is that governments, when they think they have the intelligence and the honesty to intervene in this selective way, more intelligence than the markets and more honesty than people out there, are sadly mistaken, because it almost invariably ends up with cock-ups. And cock-ups that benefit the few, a minority of insiders, politicians and business people, at the expense of everybody else. Not just foreigners, but consumers as well as competitors in the home market. That's, I think, the sad reality of this kind of industrial policy. Okay, let me now move to the present before I close and look at some of the challenges for today. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, what we've seen is that Malaysia has had a reasonably healthy rebound so far. Growth rates averaging about 5%, which is pretty good for an economy that's already advanced an advanced middle income country. And we have seen a pickup in both private investment and foreign investment, which had come down after the Asian crisis. A lot of that, I think, is due to what structural reforms the Prime Minister has introduced so far in the name of his new economic model with the ETP and the GTP. But the reality there is that, as I think many people in this room would agree, and some know far better than I, is that what has happened so far has been pretty modest and pretty slow for obvious political reasons, because what liberalization we've seen, particularly under the auspices of the ETP in services, has skirted round two big obstacles. One is, of course, the Bumiputra policy, and the other is the GLCs. And the knee-jerk reaction remains what it has been in the past, to have a public investment splurge through the GLCs. And of course, there are other problems. A fiscal deficit that continues to run too high, a public debt that is also too high, 55% or thereabouts, too much dependence on oil and gas revenue, too many subsidies consuming, what is it, about 20% of government revenue. But the particular feature I really want to concentrate on here is the role of the GLCs in the economy. It is unusually high for a small open economy like Malaysia. GLCs account for, according to some estimates, about 1/3 of economic activity. That may be a conservative estimate. They dominate certain areas: retail, construction, banking, agriculture, transport. Some would say, well, what about Singapore? They have GLCs. The difference is this. I'm a critic of GLCs in Singapore, but compared with practically everywhere else around the world, including Malaysia, they are much more subject to international commercial disciplines and less subject to political whims than elsewhere. And in Malaysia, unfortunately, with most of the GLCs, just think of Malaysian Airlines as but one example, the reality is quite the contrary. And this gets back to my earlier point. It is not accidental that the GLCs, for the most part, exist in the closed part of Malaysia's dual economy structure, with, of course, all those nefarious links. Nefarious is one of those wonderful South Asian words we South Asians like to use, including dastardly links with politicians and, of course, the political system. So, that brings me to challenges before I come to final recommendations. Everyone talks of Malaysia being in and trying to escape this middle income trap. There's a target for becoming a high income country by 2020, I think it is. To put it in as simple terms as I can, growth to date has relied very much on what the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman calls perspiration. Right? You just throw your labor and capital at the thing and you deliver more growth. Right? Well, that's fine if you're poor and catching up. But Malaysia has practically exhausted that phase. In order to grow sustainably into the future, Malaysia needs what Krugman calls inspiration. In other words, growth that depends much more on innovation and productivity. Brains, rather than brawn, as it were, because the brawn is gone. Right? To do that needs big structural reforms, much bigger than we've seen so far, and reforms that cannot skirt around these obstacles of the NEM, the Bumiputra policy, and the GLCs. And that requires big liberalization. It requires many things: an improvement in education and skills, an improvement in all sorts of governance, ranging from corporate governance to the courts, rule of law, to arguably the political system itself. But on the external